So about 7 or 8 years ago, I'm not reading this part, about 7 or 8 years ago, when I started teaching a class that focused on technology and language learning, I was very interested in telling my students about Plato, which you're going to hear about this evening. And I looked around and I stumbled across this website that had a very funky, cool orange graphic on it. And I thought, oh, this is great. And it had very good information on it. And I also read that the person who owns this website was working on a book all about Plato, and I'd never seen anything like that, and I was super interested. So I kept checking back on the website. And finally, about a year ago, I checked back on the website, and I thought, I'm going to email this person who's standing over there, and find out how's the book going. And so I emailed and was told, it's coming out this past October. This is the book. It's my copy, you can't have it. And I was very excited by that. And then about that time we were planning for CALICO, and I thought, what better focus for the keynote than the Plato project? Some of you know Plato very well. Some of you probably think it's just a Greek philosopher. So you're going to hear from Brian Deere on this topic tonight. And Brian is the author of The Friendly Orange Glow, the untold story of the Plato system and the dawn of cyber culture. He's a longtime tech startup entrepreneur and the founder of several companies, including Coconut Computing, Flatworks, Eventful, and Nettle. He's also worked at a variety of .com companies, including MP3 and eBay. And he's worked in the field of computer-based education for 8 years, including 5 on the Plato system and 3 on Ticket. His writing has appeared in Wired, Salon, Education Technology, BYTE, IEEE Expert, and the San Diego Reader. He lives with his wife in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I'd like to give you a very warm welcome to Brian Deere for his talk tonight.
Testing, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. I have to say, my wife warned me that I was not allowed under any circumstances to wear shorts to this conference. And, so I got to take a photo of Randy at some point.
My wife warned me too.
So I'm going to try to whiz through a whole bunch of slides so that we have time for questions and answers, mostly questions, hopefully some answers, and that you guys can get on to graduate sessions and stuff. So it's a real honor to be here. I mean, it was quite a surprise to be invited to be the keynote of CALICO. I've been following CALICO for years and years and years. I remember when I was on the Plato system, there were lots of CALICO members and lots of people talking about foreign language instruction and everything on Plato and in the notes files on Plato, which are, the bulletin board forums and everything. So it goes way back. And of course, I pulled a lot of literature out of CALICO Journal over the many, many years while I was doing research on this. And in fact, there were a couple of quite interesting Plato-related articles over the years. So, quick summary of topics. The book, The Level of Untoldness, and that refers to the subtitle of the book, Call on Plato, 1961 and beyond, really 60 and beyond, Teaching versus Authoring, The Tenure Problem, The Two Revolutions, The Rise of Games, Evolution and Progress, and then we'll do Q&A. So, the book came out last November, and it's the first book ever on the history of Plato, and we'll get to that in a moment. It's not your normal history book. Took just a mere 32 years to do, but one of the luxuries of taking so long was that I started early enough and I had enough brain cells to realize that I should go interview lots of people, including really prominent people in the 80s who were still prominent. Like, for example, I actually got to meet and interview B.F. Skinner and lots and lots of all the luminaries from the field of computer-assisted instruction and even teaching machines going back to the 50s. They were still alive and kicking in the 80s and 90s. So I got pretty much everybody. Did about 1,000 interviews, another reason it took so long. About 13,000 emails, and a lot of great stuff came from emails over the years. And I had to type about 7 million words of interview transcripts, which also took a wee bit of time. One other thing I did, if you are ever so inclined to do a project like this, that you plan to take about 32 years to do, one of the things I did that turned out to be a godsend, which was, in 1996, I set up a website announcing the book. I was ambitious. But I broke the first rule of journalism, which is apparently don't reveal your sources. And what I did was, every time I interviewed somebody, I put them up on a list of sources. And so what happened was that search engines would slurp that list up all the time. And people would look for their own names or names of colleagues or friends or whatever, and they'd come to my page. And then they would contact me going like, hey, you should talk to me about Plato, or you should talk to so-and-so, they're not on the list. And that worked for 20 years. It was fantastic. I mean, I would have never been able to track down. I mean, it took me 14 years to find Mike Smith. And there was a Mark A. Johnson, and believe it, there's at least 3 million Mark A. Johnsons in the United States. I think I've talked to half of them. Anyway, so the level of untoldness, if you ever go to the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, and I highly recommend that you do, it's in the heart of Silicon Valley. I call it the Smithsonian of computer history. And be sure to go straight to the front desk when you arrive, and all excited, tell them, I've just traveled thousands of miles to be here to see the Plato exhibit. And they'll go, what? I'm sorry, what's that? Plato? And they have no idea what you're talking about. So we're still that unknown, even in 2018. And even though I had a 2-day conference held at that museum, they still haven't opened the exhibit there. So we're still, Plato is one of the thin layers in this snapshot of the computer industry 1 million years from now. At the top, you're going to see all the, VR headsets and embedded biotech that we're all going to be going to the Apple Store to get injected into us in a few years. And Amazon Echoes and all that stuff. In the era where there were still physical devices. Phones, tablets, laptops, supercomputers, mini computers, desktops, mainframes, and somewhere in there is Plato. And my mission was to try to save the story of the people of Plato before that was lost, because no one was doing it. Now all I wanted to do was just curl up in a chair and read the book on the history of Plato, because I was curious. And no one was doing it, so I wound up doing it. If you look at all the other computer history books that are out there, you will find no mention of the word Plato anywhere in the text. And you can go to the back, the index, and look for the letter, P, and then look down for Plato, and you still won't find anything. Even in the most best-selling, greatest computer history book of recent times, 2014, Walt Isaacson's wonderful book, The Innovators, not mentioned at all. And I contacted him and I asked him, I said, why you don't love Plato? And he said, yeah, I knew about it, but didn't think it was important. And see, that's part of the problem. And I don't really blame these authors. There was no resource, there was no reason for them to even know about it. That's how truly unknown and untold this story is. Just a quick example. In the history of the internet, the ARPANET that formed the internet, in the early days, the architects of the ARPANET would create these documents called RFCs, which stood for Request for Comment. And today, by now, there are, many thousands of RFC documents. By 1973, it was in the hundreds. And in December 1973, they reached RFC 600. And the funny thing is, when the web came around, one of the first things they did, nerds that they were, was create repositories that were searchable and very nicely indexed and hypertext of all the RFCs. So if you go Google RFC index or something like that, you'll see there's gazillions of them even today. And for the longest time, there was one RFC missing, the only one that ever mentioned the word Plato in it. And, you know, of course, that's the one I needed during the research. And it, once again, just, you know, emblematic of the kind of level of obscurity that Plato had fallen into, that there was nothing out there. I had to track down a retired computer scientist from UC Santa Barbara who had authored the document. He had one in a file cabinet at home, which I think he faxed to me or something, you know, and I rescued it. Now it's out and everything. But, you know, and more close to home, here at the University of Illinois, I always chuckle because some of you may recognize this building. It's like a couple blocks that way. This used to be Searle, Computer-Based Education Research Lab. It's now part of the Mechanical Engineering. And there's a historical marker up front, which unfortunately is rife with minor historical inaccuracies and annoyances, but it's in the marker, so it must be true, you know. I pointed that out to the U of I, 15 years ago, and I guess there's still a committee working on it, I don't know. Another kind of funny thing about the U of I would argue that for many people in, you know, in this campus today, and certainly in the media, when they think about what's the most famous computer that ever came from the U of I, they think of the HAL 9000 from 2001: A Space Odyssey, a 1968 movie. The problem is it's of course fictional, and but far more people know about HAL. And in fact, there have been conferences over the years right here. There was one at the Krannert Center in 1997 that celebrated the anniversary of HAL. No mention of Plato, but anyway. So that's what we've been up against, and I was keen on fixing that. So a little, very quick touch on some applications of computer-assisted language learning on Plato from really early on. And this is a very hard to read thing from, I believe, the News Gazette, 1961. Don Bitzer, who was the founder of Plato, Professor Bitzer, sitting on the floor on the phone, panicking as the demo was about to start at the Allerton House nearby to give a presentation to the president then of the University of Illinois, demoing for the very first time a remote access terminal, which happens to be a portable television set with a handle on the top. The amazing thing is, talk about kludge. They had a phone line, yes, but that was for the keyboard to send signals back to the Iliac computer back at the building I just showed the photo of. The television was tuned to WILL-TV, the public television station, which didn't broadcast during the day. They broadcast during the hour that the conference was going to be held. It was not broadcasting. So if you tuned in then, you would see Plato with no sound. And that was the kludge they did to show the demo of a remote, quote-unquote, demonstration of Plato. And of course, the president of the university loved it, was blown away, and probably helped funding a great deal. By 1972, things were a lot fancier. This is the Plato 4 terminal, the famous plasma display with the orange glow. And I didn't come up with that name, by the way. That is literally what everybody called it. People would tell me, oh yeah, the friendly orange glow. You'd walk into a classroom that had no lights on because the students often like to turn them off. So you'd walk into a room with all these terminals and it looked like an air traffic control center with just orange faces as they're all like, you know, clicking away. In 2018 dollars, each of these terminals would cost about $28,000. 512 by 512 orange on black pixels and graphics and text, built-in touch-sensitive screen. They basically did a lot of crucial initial touch screen patents, including they figured out how to do multi-touch, but they didn't have the bandwidth to send that information back to the server, so they didn't implement it, but they knew how to do it and they specified it. And it would take years and years later for Apple to claim they invented it, you know, with the iPhone and the iPad. Customizable text fonts of a built-in slide projector, It was a true Rube Goldberg device because the slide projector was microfiche film and was powered by compressed air. And often, so you'd have to have a tube of compressed air next to the terminal if you were to use the microfiche. So imagine, taking this terminal, which they did all the time, on an airplane, and carrying a compressed air tube on an airplane, like a diving air tube. So the airlines kind of freaked out at that, so they had to start using basketballs, and some kid would sit on the basketball during the demo under a table, or they'd use a bicycle pump. Very Rube Goldberg. By the early 70s, probably the most impressive Plato laboratory classroom ever built was right here at the University of Illinois. This is the Foreign Languages Building basement. And its plans and budget, when they built the building, included the Plato lab, included Plato hardware. It was very smart to do. So it was actually built, and probably close to $1 million of hardware, because not only were all the terminals there were like 80 or 90, but each of them also had a random access audio device with a 15-inch floppy disk, headphones, and all kinds of stuff for that, a control room for all that equipment. It was a really amazing place, and I'm sure it's still there, and it probably has PCs, something like that now. But it started with Plato, and it was just a place to behold if you were, a kid enthralled by the orange glow in the late 70s or whatever, go and see so many of these things. Just a quick example of some of the kind of graphics you can see on these screens. So, a quick comment about teaching versus authoring. And during the Q&A, I hope some folks may have thoughts about this, because I'm really curious about this whole area. One of the great promise of the Plato project was to, it was something that turned out to be more of a great hope and less of a promise, was that, and history would show that Plato would inspire legions of K through 12 teachers and university professors to, in their copious spare time, learn how to program, design and develop, test, and deploy massive curricula of beautiful Plato lessons, all kinds of interactive features, and just wonderful learning experiences for the students. And as we realize that teachers and professors are very busy and usually don't have any time, let alone a budget. In K through 12, the notion of spending what would have then been about $6,000 or $7,000 per terminal and about $5,000 to $10,000 on phone lines per terminal per year, when they couldn't afford a piece of chalk. It was a bit of a discrepancy. And, not everyone had the time to develop this kind of material. However, Plato folks were incredibly encouraged, and rightfully so, during the 60s and 70s, because everyone had this. It was still, I argue that it was largely due to the optimism of the era, still the era of the space launch, the moon walk, and all of that. And, there was a spirit that you could still do impossible things. And a lot of what was implemented on Plato truly was impossible, and yet they did it. And in fact, what they built was so ridiculously ahead of its time, probably at least 20 years, that may also contribute to its obscurity now, because people just are in disbelief that it ever really happened. I've often argued that the story of Plato and the building of the plasma display with touchscreen and everything in 1972, releasing that in 72, and then discovering that later would be like discovering that 30 years before the Wright brothers, some other group of engineers somewhere built a jet plane and it flew 500 miles, a few years after the Civil War. And that's kind of how out of whack the timeline is in the history of computing. And the cost of offering an hour's worth of interactive lesson experiences for students was supposed to collapse just like Moore's Law did for the price of computer chips. And it worked great for Moore's Law, but it never worked for authoring. And I would argue that today, going back 45 years, there's been a steady incline rather than decline in price. When you look at things like interactive video games, their budgets are often the same as massive Hollywood blockbuster films, $100 million and up for a video game. And, I think that helps explain why so much of original authoring is gone from at least the notion that was long dreamed for Plato and works fantastically on this campus. There were Plato implementations in practically every department. Veterinary medicine had magnificent stuff, agriculture, all the foreign language stuff, sciences, English, it was really remarkable traction. University of Delaware repeated that. That campus got in early enough, they were still enthusiastic and they developed some wonderful stuff. But as Plato was installed in each subsequent campus around the world, the teachers were like, and meanwhile the rise of the microcomputers was hitting, it just didn't make economic sense to invest in Plato, which was a, increasingly outdated mainframe-based system versus micros. So a quick quote from an article that was written about Plato back in '95. Some of you may remember Robert Hart. But he just said a few things also relating to teaching and authoring and the plight of professors who were trying to use Plato, and in his case, in language instruction. He said, we had to build up a sizable wish list of features we wanted. Bruce Sherwood, who worked at the Plato Lab, agreed to come over to the language laboratory and discuss matters with the assembled language project staff. We described what we needed. Bruce explained that a few of the things we asked for could probably be added to Tutor, the programming language, but more advanced features were simply impractical. Advanced lesson designs that we had been brainstorming could only be done with great difficulty, the majority not at all. Building language courseware on Plato 4 was going to be mostly a matter of refining drill and tutorial design. A handful of sophisticated activities were eventually implemented. For instance, an elegant parser-driven sentence interpreter developed by Bob Yeager's elementary reading project and a French text-to-speech system that Fernand Marty and I built. But these represented a tour de force of tutor programming rather than readily deployable techniques. The whole episode simply reflected a structural flaw built into the Plato 4 project. System control of tutor development meant that Tutor could be optimized for Plato hardware. It also relieved lesson authors of the impossible burden of building a programming language, and it guaranteed a homogeneous, stable programming environment. In these ways, central control was valuable, but in more subtle ways, it retarded work on instructional design because the people building Tutor were only loosely coupled to the people doing actual instruction. The system staff was answerable not only to the foreign language project, but to physics, veterinary medicine, accountancy, and chemistry, and many, many other disciplines. Their time and resources were limited, so when adding to Tutor, they naturally favored generic features useful to everyone. And so it was kind of like the curse of the Tutor language. It was incredibly powerful, but each discipline needed special capabilities, and it was very, very hard to get them in. I will add that one way to guarantee you get them in is if you baked a sheet of wonderful chocolate chip cookies and gave them to the system programmers. If you gave them in like 6 o'clock at night, you might have your feature by 6 a.m. So I think it still works if you try that today. So also I wanted to comment quickly on the tenure problem, which was an unexpected consequence of the blossoming of the Plato system with professors here at U of I and many other campuses that use Plato. It was something that no one expected. If you wanted tenure, you had to obey the rule that bits were valued more than atoms. Bits were less valued than atoms. When I was doing research on the history of Plato, I interviewed many professors here at U of I and at other campuses, and I was really surprised to hear that so many of them, had slaved on Plato for years building works of art that their students loved and were, pretty amazing experiences for online learning. And, but to do so, you know, put your career in peril. And I don't know if that's true today. That would be interesting to learn. Some of the most famous work on Plato done on this campus here came at a price, years delay in being granted tenure, or perhaps never being granted tenure at all. Here's a brief excerpt from a book on one music professor's experience that I thought I'd quickly read. This was at the U of I. Despite the broad support for Plato within the School of Music, Peters, the professor, did find that spending a large amount of one's career on the system came at a cost. Like Plato, using professors in other departments, Peters found that his chances for tenure were in jeopardy if all he did was work on Plato. I was racing around doing all this work, he said, and I had some of the senior faculty in the music education, they just said, look, this is great, you did some great work, but it's not going to get you tenure. If you want to get tenure, you have to write a book. So Peters went and wrote a textbook, 20 music compositions and other publications of the School of Music's tenure committee. Peters says, quote, I don't know if they didn't value Plato, they just totally didn't get it. They didn't understand it, and they couldn't, you know, a book you can pick up, you can weigh it, it has atoms. Well, that's heavy enough for a tenure, you know. But with Plato, they just couldn't get their mind around whether it was important or not. So I would not have gotten tenure at Illinois if I hadn't written a textbook and some other publications. And that was a common theme, really surprising to me. I don't know if that's the same now. So on to another completely different topic, what I call the two revolutions. And this is more of a general theme about Plato and the history of computing, in particular personal computing. And we've all heard of the personal computer revolution, and we probably have all read books or magazine articles or seen TV shows or movies or whatever on, you know, the usual Apple, Microsoft, Steve Jobs, blah, 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 Google, you know, everybody started in a garage, it's all so wonderful, blah, blah, blah. But I would argue, and I submit this book as evidence, Exhibit A, that there was also an interpersonal computer revolution. And it's nowhere near as clear or known or defined or discussed. It's assumed that the PC revolution predates the interpersonal computer revolution. It's assumed that the PC revolution led to, you know, we needed PCs before we could all be hacking online. It's assumed that, you know, we started with PCs and the social side emerged from the networking of personal computers. And I would argue that despite what we've been told, despite what the books all say, despite what Silicon Valley and its Bible, Wired magazine will tell you, this is not how things went down. So is the reverse the case? Did the interpersonal computer revolution lead to the personal computer revolution? And I would say no. The way I describe it is differently. I describe it as kind of a merge onto the freeway by personal computing, where interpersonal computing was already in progress. But once personal computing arrived, it influenced it greatly. And what I'm talking about here, you know, interpersonal computing is probably better known as by the phrase the killer app, at least in Silicon Valley circles, which basically describes the use of computers to connect people together, basically. And the discovery that the most valuable use of personal computers and devices, you know, phones and stuff today, is people yakking. I mean, that's all they do, texting, Facebooking, Twittering, you know, everything. Instagram and all that. It's all about yakking. And what I argue in my book is that, in fact, Silicon Valley didn't understand the social side at all. There were maybe a few pockets that did, but they didn't really influence it very much, particularly in the 70s. And there were just a handful of tiny little examples where they were testing it out and doing things, but it did not have anywhere near the impact or the scale that Plato had. You have to understand that Plato's system and its network of users around the world was larger than ARPANET until about 1982. Until about, I think, 81, the ARPANET user community was small enough that they printed a physical paperback book that you would distribute, and that would have everyone's name and email address and affiliation and all that. And that's how people kept in touch with each other. Plato was probably many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of total users, and all over the world. And there's a particular historical moment in the history of the Plato system, largely right here on this campus, in a 12-month period from about mid-73 to mid-74, where the light bulb went off and the inmates took over the asylum, as it were. Basically, this massive wave of kids came in. And the remarkable thing is they were not chased away. And I credit largely that to Professor Bitzer, who had this philosophy that don't chase away the kids. You know, they're not only your customers, but they may be your next employee too. In fact, they're way cheaper, so make them your next employee. And so all these kids would come over, any from Uni High across the street from the old Searle building. Uni High's still there. And within that 1 year, all these kids completely turned Plato upside down, using the tutor language that was intended for professors to develop, lesson material, interactive lessons. They built chat rooms, instant messaging, message forums, screen sharing. They formed a whole hacker community. They caused the first major incident with the White House, the Nixon White House, who was so furious, and I have a whole chapter on this, they were so furious with the students talking about advocating the impeachment of Richard Nixon, that the Nixon White House, which controlled the National Science Foundation and ARPA, the two funders of Plato, they basically said, we're going to kill ARPANET and Plato if you don't cut this out immediately. And in fact, a major ARPA project lost $1 billion funding because of the advocacy of impeaching Nixon. Imagine that today. It was the rise of a lot of online jargon, email, emoticons, which I jokingly call platoji. Okay, I promise I'll only say one more time. Multiplayer games, an online newspaper. There was an early app ecosystem. There was the first examples of phishing, online personae. Basically, the good, bad, the ugly of the social, cultural experience of being online was in full force on Plato, just at a smaller scale. So there was basically probably the same proportions of good, bad, and ugly, except that the university was a really good filter, and the commercial side of computing hadn't really taken off. So there was no advertising or any of that kind of pressure to spam people or that kind of thing, like there is today. What I would argue is that my research shows is that if the tools are of a sufficient efficacious level, and there's enough functionality for interpersonal communication, then it just happens. The programmers will discover it, and you're going to have it even if you hadn't planned on it. That's what you'll get. That's what Plato showed, that's what the web showed. The web was meant for sharing documents in a hypertext environment. It wasn't meant for chat rooms and Facebook and stuff like that. I'm going to skip that in the interest of time, and briefly I'll say the dinner conversation problem was, it was very, very common for a Plato person in the 70s to go home after being online all day long before you go back to be online all night long. You might have dinner with the family, and you would just tell them, today I talked to people in South Africa and Hawaii and New York and all these locations, and they'd go like, that must have cost a fortune. Whose phone line were you using? And you'd say, no, that's all term talk on Plato. And then you'd have to spend the entire conversation at dinner explaining Plato, term talk, which was basically instant messaging, and the notion of networks and that there are other people out there and everything. And by then they would all run away, by the time you were finished. Compare that to today. If you wanted to tell someone about just what happened in the news, you'd probably sit down at a dinner table and each family member would be, right, staring at their personal screen, playing games or Twittering or Facebooking or whatever, and probably no one's talking to each other. So I guess that's progress in 40 years. But quick example of what I meant by emoticons, or what I jokingly call Platoji, because it's interesting, and I bring this up because this shows again how the Plato system was kind of like a digital Galapagos. It was a completely separate ecosystem than mainstream computing or the ARPANET or the internet or anything like that. Everything was different, slightly askew, different terminology, different approaches, but the same needs. It had a big enough user community that things would happen just like emoticons. You didn't have sideways smilings. You would create characters by combining letters. This is the actual Plato text font, and WOB text was a very common one. I'll show you what you do. You start with the letter W. In the Plato keyboard, there was a way if you press Shift Space, it actually backspaced, and then if you typed, it would overlay the next character. So you get, instead of W-O, you shift space and you get that. And you keep B-T-A-X. And so, that's how you create smileys. And of course, this led to students dropping out of university in order to explore the infinite possibilities of Plato emoticons. Here's another one real quickly. O plus capital V led to that. And so, a lot of people would embed this kind of stuff on Plato. These are the kind of notes you'd see people would create beer, glasses of beer, like this stuff. There was also animation, which I can't replicate right now, but you took an exclamation point, a side slash, a hyphen, another one, backslash, and you kept going like that, and there was a way to also do mode replace, which would not overlay, it would be on top of, but you could actually animate it quickly, and it would be a baton twirling. So in time, by 77, there were full renderings of scenes from Star Wars on Plato. I'll put it that way. Wow. Some of these people spent weeks on one message. There was also the rise of games, which is important in some ways. And again, the great irony here is that the Plato system, its mission, its funding, from the U.S. government, was intended for, figuring out how can we make computers teach, and what will we learn from doing that, and what insights can we learn, and can this scale, and things like that. It was a very legitimate project, and there were tremendous learnings. But the great irony is this mission-oriented educational computing system wound up causing many college students losing their college careers, either flunking out or failing out or dropping out. Many to work on the Plato system because they had so much experience, they were incredibly valuable. Some worked right here at the U of I, they got great jobs. Some people took 15, 17 years to finish a degree and many didn't. And it's just kind of an irony. Quickly on the game stuff, I won't go through all this. They're just every imaginable game you can imagine. Usually the history of computer games lacks any mention of the stuff that happened on Plato, but it was all prior to even the first personal computer games. This stuff was very advanced. There were, huge, dark industries of people selling virtual goods for real cash. There's a lot more in the book if you want to know about this stuff. So, evolution and progress. One thing I've always been really fascinated with, I mentioned the notion of a digital Galapagos, is kind of the evolution of computing, the evolution of software, of the uses of computing in education. And one of the things I've just noticed is that oftentimes what happens is you build on the shoulders of what's gone on in the past. You learn from it, you examine the inadequacies of previous applications, even if they're very popular. Nothing ever makes everyone happy. And so people think, you know, well, if we took 80% of this thing and then added, you know, our own new 20%, we'd have something new, we could call it new, and so you saw that on Plato with the games. All the games listed here are Dungeons and Dragon games. They were incredibly advanced, they were 3D, you know, it's just unbelievable, all multi-user and everything, and they got very, very advanced. And then in terms of social networking, you know, we evolved from 6 Degrees and Friendster to LinkedIn and MySpace and Facebook, Twitter and Slack. And the evolution continues. You know, the joke is there's probably 20 groups of kids in 20 different garages around Silicon Valley, maybe elsewhere in the world right now, who are building Facebook's successor, and more power to them. And then, you know, in terms of search engines, the same pattern is exhibited. You know, we started with Excite and Yahoo and WebCrawler and Lycos. Maybe some of these services ring a distant bell. InfoSeek, AltaVista. You know, eventually Google came around in response to the inadequacies of everything that had come before. They had a new way of doing things called PageRank. And, you know, we haven't seen a lot of innovation in search since. It's been very gradual and incremental, but I suspect there will be more coming. And so what I wonder, my big question, which I'm going to leave you with, is why don't you see this, I would argue, in the field of computers and education? It seems like a lot of things get built and a lot of things get forgotten and new things get built that aren't even aware of what was built before and don't address the inadequacies of what happened before. They just build on present needs in their own little funnel of what they know. Now maybe that's just because everybody's incredibly busy for, you know, and there isn't a lot of, you know, of history out there, I don't know. But I find in this particular field, that's always troubled me, is that you don't see the same kind of evolution happening, and if you disagree, I welcome a discussion on it, because I'm really, really interested in that area. I may write an article about it or something, unless you guys think I'm completely off the wall with that notion, but it's the one area I think that we are still seeking an answer to. So with that, we'll do a Q&A, and thanks for listening. Yeah.
This is a short question, so I don't know if I need this. Is there a Plato simulator?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. In 2004, a bunch of die-hard, long-term Plato addicts created something called cyber1.org, which is an amazing feat if you really think about what they did. It's CYBER, the number 1.org, and I encourage everyone to go to that site, download the macro Windows free client program, get an account, and you'll be on a real Plato system. They not only got, it's running on an emulated control data cyber mainframe that's running in like an Intel box. You know, like one little pizza box, you know, a little tiny thing that probably could support many thousands of simultaneous users, more than any $20 million control data mainframe could ever. But it has the entire catalog of the University of Illinois lesson output from all the professors all over the years. So there's a tremendous historical value to the site, and there's a very active community on it. So yeah, check it out. Yeah.
So you've made a very interesting presentation about how fascinating Plato is and how obscure it is ended up being. I'd like to explore two tiny bits of that. One is, I'm aware that Plato included the foreign language or the language Esperanto, personal interest of mine. I'm interested in how its level of obscurity related to other foreign languages within Plato, and then how foreign languages in general related within Plato to all the other subjects that you've mentioned, agriculture, music, those other things.
Well, when you say related to, you mean compare?
Yeah,
In terms of scale or whatever?
Tell us funny stories, something.
Well, I mean, I think the Esperanto story is that it was a personal passion of a physicist named Bruce Sherwood, who I think you know. That's my understanding, is that he wanted that. He loved Esperanto, and I think he long felt that the world would finally be perfect if we were all yakking, including online on Plato and Esperanto. But of course, that never happened. Maybe still someday, you know. So I never really saw, you know, Esperanto courseware being used much. I know it was used, but I wasn't even sure if that was actually, you may know more than I in terms of whether that was an actual 4-credit college course online. You know, one thing I should add is that, you know, it's remarkable to think about the fact that on Plato, as early as about 64, 65, they were offering actual courses online for full credit. So when you read about the history of online learning, it often starts with MOOCs, you know, which were like around 2005, 2007. Or if they knew about like personal computers, they may start a little earlier. But with Plato, they were doing 4 credit, you know, fully college credit courses online in the 60s, and then it really exploded in the 70s. There were many, many, many courses. And many times you could take it either as like as a fully online course for an entire quarter or trimester or whatever, or take a traditional class. And they often did that so that they could gather data and compare the two. I don't know if they did that in foreign languages. You know, I was never able to interview Keith Myers or Fernand Marty over at FLP here. So my knowledge of the language instruction stuff, ironically, is probably the weakest. I probably know more about veterinary medicine and, you know, other disciplines, because I was able to reach those professors over the years. But you know, I think the laboratory, the FLP building's basement lab attests to how humongously major Plato was to foreign language instruction on this campus. It was, you know, one of the biggest efforts on campus, period. And I'm sure all the dignitaries were trotted through it, you know, for many, many years to impress, you know, the brass and the funding agencies. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I'm going to show some ignorance. I was actually here from 78 to 83. It was a French major. We went to France and came back and got a business degree at job afterwards. But I'm just trying to think through the coding piece here. Is there any tie to that when we were talking about this? Because I took a computer science class in 81, and I mean, that was actually coding. And I'm thinking this is the other end of it.
No, I mean, there was a full programming language on Plato. It was called Tutor. That's what I was mentioning before. That was the programming language. Now, it wasn't the same as, I'll put it this way, computer science departments worldwide, then and now, scoff at the tutor language. It's not considered worthy. It is a special language really for authoring interactive, you know, educational experiences online. And so that's what it was custom tailored for, a huge amount of answer judging and answer processing, and evaluating typed responses or touched or whatever, you know, that kind of thing. It was not meant as a general purpose programming language that you build a compiler in or something like that, which you might learn in CS 101 or something like that. And so interestingly, there was very little, there was some support for computer science here on the campus and in other campuses, but some enterprising students who were CS majors but knew about Plato in the 70s, and I talk about this in the book, would do all their homework on Plato because it had a beautiful text editor and free printing and all kinds of stuff, and they could, in fact, there were simulators of BASIC and I think Pascal and Logo and some other languages, maybe Lisp, on Plato that people had built. So you could do all your work on Plato and not have to book time over in this punch card hell over in like DCL or wherever here at U of I, you know. So yeah.
Yeah, I remember in about 79, they had the cards being thrown out of the top.
Yep.
They could throw the building.
Yep.
Thank you. I'm wondering, the people you interviewed, some of the people who took 15 years or whatever to finish their degree because they were sidetracked by Plato, were you able to follow up and find out that maybe some of these people who had some of these early experiences did enter the computer industry or go on to careers where this experience with Plato, as students had some formative experience that developed some sort of literacies, computer literacies that then they took to other places.
Right. Yeah, having a career in tech was the rule, not the exception, for people who were what everyone called Plato addicts, as undergrads here at U of I and at other campuses, me included. Yeah, I mean, the Plato people that I interviewed had fascinating career tracks. I often call them careens more than careers because it's like pinball. They bounced all over the place, but they were very smart, lucrative bounces. Oftentimes they would wind up going to Silicon Valley, starting at Atari, getting some street cred at Atari, and then going to Apple or Sun, having a very nice career there, sometimes 15 years, and then going to Google as a senior distinguished engineer. But there are several people at Google who are like VP level now, who are old Plato hands, and have seen everything, and now they're like responsible for the football field-sized data centers, which arguably are just big mainframes. I mean, you could, we talk about like, well, the era of the mainframe is over. It's not over. You need a physical dam, hydroelectric dam, or miles wide of solar collection to power the mainframes that run every online service you use today. So mainframes never left. Their design changed. It became very modular, where each module is a PC, basically. But yeah, Plato people are still everywhere. They're still, many of them still working. The author of Avatar, one of the most famous dungeon games on Plato, is a longtime principal engineer at Amazon. They're still on.
So I think we're out of time, so I'd like to thank Brian very much for his very